When Karen called the cops on her neighbor, she had no idea he was the county's chief attorney, and that call would end her HOA reign forever. The morning sun reflected off Karen's oversized sunglasses as she stood at the edge of my newly constructed farm fence, her face turning an alarming shade of purple. She had her phone pressed against her ear, and I could hear her shrill voice from 50 feet away. "I need the police here immediately," she screamed into the device. "My neighbor has illegally blocked my access road. This is false imprisonment. I demand you send someone right now." Her free hand gestured wildly at the fence, as if the 911 operator could somehow see her theatrical performance. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined in her self-righteous fury, was that the person she was calling the police on wasn't just her neighbor. I was the chief attorney for the county, and she had just made the biggest mistake of her HOA presidential career. It all started 3 years ago when I moved to Pine Valley Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood with rolling hills and mature oak trees. The property I'd purchased included 5 acres of legally zoned farmland that backed up to the community tennis courts. I'd chosen this particular lot because it offered the perfect blend of suburban convenience and rural tranquility. What I hadn't anticipated was inheriting Karen as a neighbor, the self-appointed guardian of all things proper and acceptable in our little corner of the world. From day one, she made it clear that my presence was an affront to her carefully curated community standards. The first incident happened just 2 weeks after I'd moved in. I was unpacking boxes in my garage when Karen marched up my driveway, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking against the concrete with military precision. "Excuse me," she said with a tone that suggested anything but politeness. "I'm Karen Henderson, president of the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association." She didn't wait for my response before launching into her rehearsed speech. "I've noticed you've parked a truck in your driveway that exceeds the approved vehicle height limit by 3 inches. You'll need to find alternative parking arrangements immediately or face a fine." I calmly explained that the HOA rule she was citing didn't apply to my property, as my farmland was grandfathered in under different zoning laws. Her face tightened, but she retreated, only to return the next day with a complaint about the color of my mailbox. Over the following months, Karen's visits became as regular as the morning newspaper. She complained about everything imaginable. The native wildflowers I'd planted were weeds. My rescued chickens made excessive noise at dawn, and my vegetable garden was unsightly from the street. Each time, I responded with patience and documentation, showing her the county ordinances that protected my right to maintain a working farm on my property. But Karen wasn't interested in facts or laws. She was interested in control, and my refusal to bend to her will only fueled her determination. The real trouble began when I noticed Karen cutting across my back pasture to reach the tennis courts. The first few times, I assumed she'd gotten lost or was taking a one-time shortcut, but soon it became a daily routine. Every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, Karen would emerge from her backyard, stride across my property in her tennis whites, and disappear through the hedge on the far side. Her path was wearing a visible trail through my carefully maintained grass. When I politely asked her to use the designated community path, she laughed in my face. "I've been using this route for 15 years, she declared with a dismissive wave. "That gives me an easement by custom. Look it up." I did look it up, and as I suspected, her claim had no legal basis whatsoever. I tried everything to resolve the situation amicably. I sent certified letters asking her to respect my property boundaries. I offered to meet with her to discuss alternative routes. I even proposed installing a gravel path along the edge of my property that she could use with my permission. Every attempt at compromise was met with escalating hostility. Karen began submitting formal HOA complaints against me for increasingly ridiculous violations. She claimed my rooster violated noise ordinances, despite the fact that agricultural properties were exempt. She insisted my compost bin was a health hazard, even though it was properly maintained and located well within code requirements. She even tried to argue that my heritage apple trees were attracting pests and needed to be removed. The situation reached a breaking point when Karen organized what she called a neighborhood watch meeting that was really just a thinly veiled campaign to turn the community against me. She spread rumors that I was planning to expand my farm operations, that I intended to bring in large livestock, and that property values would plummet as a result. Several neighbors approached me with concerns, and I spent hours showing them my actual plans. A small vegetable garden, a handful of chickens, and maybe a couple of goats for brush control. Most were relieved and even supportive, which only made Karen more furious. That's when I decided to build the fence. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I preferred the open, welcoming feel of an unfenced property. But Karen's increasingly aggressive trespassing left me no choice. I hired a surveyor to mark the exact property lines, obtained all necessary permits, and contracted with a reputable fencing company. The fence would be 6 feet tall, made of attractive cedar boards, and would run along the exact legal boundary of my property. I even made sure to set it back 6 inches from the property line to avoid any possible disputes. Every detail was meticulously planned and documented. The day the fence went up, I watched from my kitchen window as Karen discovered her shortcut had been blocked. She stood there for a full 5 minutes, staring at the wooden barrier as if she could make it disappear through sheer force of will. Then she marched around to my front door and pounded on it with her fist. When I answered, she was practically spitting with rage. "You take this down immediately," she demanded, with a voice that could have stripped paint. "This is illegal. You can't block my access." I calmly explained that the fence was entirely on my property, built to code, and perfectly legal. I suggested she use the community path like everyone else. Her response was to storm off while shouting threats about lawsuits and HOA interventions. The next morning, I was enjoying my coffee when I heard Karen's voice carrying across the yard. She was on her phone, pacing back and forth along the fence line, gesticulating wildly. As I stepped onto my back porch, I could make out her words clearly. She was calling 911, claiming she was being held against her will, that I had maliciously blocked her legal right-of-way, and demanding immediate police intervention. I couldn't help but shake my head at the absurdity of it all. She was standing in her own backyard, free to go anywhere she pleased, except across my private property. Within 15 minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up to my house. I recognized both officers immediately. Officer Martinez had testified in several cases I'd prosecuted, and Officer Chun had just completed training on property law that I'd helped develop. They approached my door with professional courtesy, though I could see the confusion in their eyes. "Good morning, counselor," Officer Martinez said with a slight smile. "We received a rather unusual complaint. Something about false imprisonment and blocked access?" I invited them in and offered coffee while I gathered my documentation. As I laid out the property surveys, permits, and correspondence on my dining room table, I could see understanding dawn on their faces. "So let me get this straight," Officer Chan said slowly. "Ms. Henderson has been trespassing on your property for years, refused to stop when asked, and is now claiming you've imprisoned her by building a legal fence on your own land?" I nodded and handed him the stack of certified letters I'd sent to Karen. "That's correct. And as you can see from these documents, I've tried every reasonable approach to resolve this situation. Officer Martinez was already shaking his head. We'll need to have a word with Ms. Henderson about misuse of emergency services. We walked outside together where Karen was waiting by the fence, arms crossed, foot tapping impatiently. Her confident expression faltered when she saw me walking with the officers. Finally, she exclaimed with renewed indignation, "Officers, I want this man arrested for false imprisonment and destruction of an established easement." Officer Martinez held up a hand to stop her tirade. "Ma'am, we've reviewed the situation. Mr. Johnson's fence is entirely legal and on his own property. What you're describing isn't false imprisonment. It's trespassing prevention." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But I'm the HOA president," she sputtered with disbelief in her voice. "He can't just block access that's been used for 15 years. Officer Chun stepped forward with authority. "Actually, ma'am, he can. And more importantly, your claimed easement has no legal standing. Mr. Johnson is the county's chief attorney, and I can assure you his documentation is impeccable." The color drained from Karen's face as the implications hit her. She'd been harassing the chief attorney for the county, spreading false rumors about him, and had just called 911 with a fabricated emergency. Furthermore, Officer Martinez continued with a stern tone. Calling 911 for a non-emergency, especially one involving false claims, is a misdemeanor offense. We could cite you right now for misuse of emergency services. Karen began backing away, her bravado completely evaporated. I didn't know. I thought. Her voice trailed off as she realized there was no good way to finish that sentence. The officers exchanged glances before Officer Chun spoke again. "We're going to let you off with a warning this time, Ms. Henderson. But any further harassment of Mr. Johnson or misuse of emergency services will result in criminal charges. Do you understand?" Karen nodded mutely, her face now pale except for 2 bright spots of red on her cheeks. As the officers prepared to leave, Officer Martinez turned back to her with one final comment. "Oh, and Ms. Henderson? You might want to inform your HOA board about today's incident. I have a feeling they'll be very interested to hear how their president has been representing the community." With that, they returned to their patrol cars, leaving Karen standing alone by the fence, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Word travels fast in a suburban neighborhood, and by that evening, several board members had already heard about the morning's drama. My next-door neighbor, who served as the HOA treasurer, stopped by to apologize for Karen's behavior and to assure me that the board would be reviewing the situation. Within 3 days, an emergency board meeting was called. I received a formal invitation to attend and present my side of the story, though it was clear from the tone that the board was already leaning heavily in my favor. The meeting was held in the community center, and the room was packed. News of Karen's confrontation with the police had spread throughout the neighborhood, and everyone wanted to witness what promised to be a spectacular downfall. Karen sat at the head of the board table, but her usual commanding presence was notably absent. She fidgeted with her papers and avoided eye contact with the crowd. When it came time for me to speak, I simply presented the facts, the documented trespassing, the harassment, the false HOA complaints, and finally, the misuse of emergency services. The board members asked few questions, as the evidence spoke for itself. When they called for a vote on Karen's removal from the presidency, it was unanimous. Karen's face crumbled as each hand raised against her. The final blow came when the board secretary announced that they would also be reviewing all fines and violations Karen had issued during her tenure for potential bias and overreach. As the gavel came down on the motion, Karen stood abruptly, knocking over her chair in her haste to leave. She rushed from the room with tears streaming down her face. Her reign of HOA terror officially ended. 2 weeks later, I received a formal letter of apology from the new HOA board, along with confirmation that all complaints against my property had been dismissed. They even offered to reimburse me for the legal fees I'd incurred defending against Karen's baseless accusations. I declined the reimbursement but accepted their apology. As a final touch to ensure my property remained trespass-free, I installed a motion-activated sprinkler system just inside the fence line. It was perfectly legal, environmentally friendly, and remarkably effective at deterring unwanted visitors. The first time Karen discovered the sprinklers, I happened to be working in my garden. I heard a shriek followed by the sound of rapid footsteps retreating. When I looked up, I saw her standing in her backyard, drenched from head to toe, water dripping from her previously perfect hair. She glared at me through the fence, her mouth working soundlessly as she struggled to find words that wouldn't come. Finally, she turned and stalked back to her house, leaving wet footprints on her patio. That was 3 months ago, and she hasn't set foot near my property since. The new HOA president tells me Karen rarely leaves her house now, too embarrassed to face the neighbors who witnessed her spectacular fall from power. Sometimes justice comes in the form of a courtroom verdict. Sometimes it comes as a motion-activated sprinkler. Justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it's armed with a fence and a sprinkler. If you enjoyed watching Karen get legally humbled, make sure to like and subscribe. And remember, always check who you're messing with before dialing 911.